Now, hotel rooms in the Republic tend to be expensive, perhaps even very expensive in the case of Dublin. That's a fact of life by now. But have we reached the stage where international tourists have decided that enough is enough and they'll take their custom elsewhere?
Official figures suggest that tourist visitors have fallen sharply at the start of this year. In January, numbers were down 25% compared to the same month last year. It was even worse in February, with a 30% year-on-year drop. So what's going on? Let's speak to the tourism and travel expert, Eoghan Corry. Thanks for joining us. Let's set this out in terms of numbers. I mean, what are people having to pay for a night away in Dublin or in the Republic at the moment?
Well, the average hotel price in February and January split comes well down. People tend to, with a couple of exceptions, which I'll go into, what people tend to concentrate on in pricing is the peak weekends when Taylor Swift comes to town, when Oasis comes to town, and the January rugby matches, January and February. Usually the England match is the one that sends a €100 room up to about €450. But there's no doubt the average price has come up by maybe 30% since pre-pandemic. But because hotels employ dynamic pricing, when demand is high, they charge high. When demand is low, they tend to charge less. The overall pricing is really, really hard to track.
Are you finding people maybe going away but staying for one night instead of two? Are behaviours training when it comes to visitors?
Last CSO figures we saw, the average trip within Ireland came down very, very slightly from 2.1 nights to 1.9. That would be the domestic trip. The trip abroad also came down slightly. I think that maybe post-pandemic, as people were coming back to travel, they travelled a little bit less the first year and a little bit more in the second year. But the CSO figures that you're talking about, the 30% plunge in February and the 25% in January, is not really being borne out by the stats I'm seeing elsewhere. The Irish Hotel Federation say that the room occupancy is pretty much similar to what it was last year. Booking.com, the big aggregators, say it's flat, it's not growing. And the Dublin Airport passenger numbers were also flat, not growing. There's another issue there with the passenger cap, 3% reduction on the transatlantic. But it doesn't really reflect the big decrease shown in the CSO figures. And a lot of people are scratching their heads.
Yeah. Owen, because in my day job, I'm an economics reporter, and usually when I see very big short-term movements, like 25% down and 30% down, I ask myself, is this a real change or is this a measurement issue? And are you maybe suggesting here there is something up with these stats that don't actually reflect the reality on the ground?
Absolutely, and it'll be very interesting. You know, the airport stats. It's very easy in an island, and you can measure everyone that's coming on and off through the airports and the ports. The Belfast stats for February aren't in yet, but I would expect them to be up, not massively. They got quite a few of the rugby flights that would have gone to Dublin because of the passenger cap in Dublin. But I'd expect an increase of 4, 5, 6% even. That's an increase, not a decrease. So what we're looking at is the metrics, and we do know the CSO have, they're being very silent on this issue, but they have said they changed the metrics from pre-pandemic to post-pandemic. And if you compare inbound tourism with pre-pandemic, there's a lot of missing tourists. There's about 2 million tourists that never came back. It's not being reflected by the sentiment of the businesses, although they tend to complain that about cost base, things like that. The visitor numbers aren't down by that huge number. Most of Europe is coming back to about 95% of pre-pandemic, and the airport figures, the airline figures tend to be above that. So we wonder about the metrics. As you suggest, a big short-term fall like that, without it being reflected in other statistics, does raise questions.
But there is a growing perception, I think, certainly on this side of the border, that going to the Republic is becoming prohibitively expensive. It was never necessarily a cheap tourism destination, but in recent years, the feeling has been this is now just silly money we've been asked.
Yeah, if you turn up for the Taylor Swift weekend, it's pretty dramatic. What hotels will famously charge, what the market will bear. And the one thing we have to keep an eye on in terms of international tourism is what our competitors are doing. Scotland being the classic example, they do very similar sort of the golf tourism and the scenery tourism and the culture tourism that we do. So while there's a lot of complaint about price, there is a general raising of price right across Europe. The restaurant prices in Ireland quite expensive compared with Southern Europe. But what we always had as an advantage was Ryanair, and in Belfast case EasyJet as well, that access airfares tend to be lower than an awful lot of other major markets that people go to. We also have to be very, very careful with the American market. They saved both the north and south of the border. They saved the summer for the last 2 summers because Britain has been down consistently since Brexit. France and Germany never recovered to the level they did pre-pandemic. And the Americans, they're our second biggest inbound market for both jurisdictions, and they're also the biggest spender in both jurisdictions. So they're the ones we have to watch. Yeah. And there are other factors at play there that have been well reported in your channel and everybody else's.
Eoghan Corry, thank you very much indeed. So unfortunately, Claire, rather than spinning the numbers down, it might just be like a boring story about not being able to measure tourism properly. Sorry about that.